Next up is Peter Gray. And this conversation is going to be a bit different than the other ones at the summit, mainly because we were forced to call in the substitute interviewer for this session, namely me. So you're going to be seeing a lot more of me than you're used to. But I just had so much fun talking to Peter. Peter and I, our paths have crossed over the years. I first became aware of him when he was blogging on the Psychology Today website, and I would constantly be looking at his blog posts and inspiring myself and some of the posts that I wrote. And when his book came out, Free to Learn, it was a real game changer for me. He put words to a lot of things that maybe I had intuited over the years, but also just opened my mind to really and truly how children learn through their own self-directed activities, which is what in early years we call play-based education. He is my go-to guy when someone is confronted with the challenge of having to defend play-based learning, because he has the research. He's a researcher and scholar, and he has the research at his fingertips to defend our perspective and our point of view. So in that sense, he's incredibly valuable. But I love listening to him talk because he really knows his stuff, and he can take on any challenge with facts rather than just opinions. I really want you to pay attention too in the middle part of this interview. Peter shares with us some results from a survey that he took part in about children's attitudes during the COVID quarantine time, and also parents' attitudes. And I think it was really eye-opening for me and incredibly hopeful. The other thing that I really want to just put a point on here from what Peter had to say is what he has to say to us in early childhood education. If we really want things to change for children, if we really want things to get better, he's calling on us to ally ourselves with one another and also with parents to come together and see if we can create a better environment for young children going forward. I think you're going to learn a lot from this. If you've not heard Peter speak before, I think you're in for a real treat. You're going to want to rewind this over and over again and take tons of notes, because I sure did. So enjoy. Hi, welcome to the Play First Summit today with Peter Gray, and you've got your substitute interviewer today, Teacher Tom. Peter he's a researcher and scholar at Boston College. He is the author of a very well-regarded introductory psychology textbook, a blogger. His blog is called Freedom to Learn on Psychology Today. And the most pertinent thing for me, and I think for everybody here, he's the author of the book Free to Learn. And I just want to tell you briefly, when I heard Peter had written a book, I'd been reading his blog, and I bought the book. And you know how books are. Sometimes you kind of carry them around with you a little bit for a few days before you get around to it. And I had taken it on a trip and found myself in a in a long delay in Toronto. And I said, okay, I'll pick this up, and he's a researcher, right? So I thought, okay, maybe I'll get through one chapter. And I sat there and I read the whole thing while I sat there in the Toronto airport. And every single page, Peter, has a moment where I said, aha, or that's what I've been struggling with, or I didn't understand that. It was just one of the best reads I've ever had in my life in terms of just making me feel like, man, I have been in the dark on so many things. And then sometimes making me feel like, oh, wow, I've intuitively known some of these things for a long time. And it was great that what I tell people all the time is that, because so many of us in play-based education and self-directed learning find ourselves having to defend ourselves all the time. And people say, well, where's your research? Well, there's a nice hefty bibliography on this book. And I point people to that quite often as well. So anyway, you're also the founding member, Peter, of the Alliance for Self-Directed Learning and a new organization called Let It Grow. And we'll get to talk about those in a couple minutes. I'll ask you about those. But first, Peter, I would love for you to tell us, how did you get involved with schools? How did you get involved with thinking about schools and getting around to writing what you do about education?
Yeah, so when I first began to seriously get interested in education, it was many, many years ago. I had been very happily doing neuroscience research in my laboratory, mucking around with the brains of rats and mice and looking at how hormones get bound in certain areas and how it affects some of their motivated behavior. But meanwhile, I had a child who was starting to go to school. We were living in Framingham, Massachusetts. It's a sort of a suburb of Boston, kind of partly suburb of Boston. And supposedly had a good school. One of the reasons people move anywhere is, at least if you're middle class or can afford to, you try to move to some place that has this reputation of a good school. We were not unlike other people. My son went to kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, fighting it every inch of the way. His mother and I were frequently brought into teachers' meetings. Yeah, it's an interesting experience being called in to a teachers' meeting. Here I'm a professor, at Boston College, but suddenly I'm sitting in a little chair there listening to the teacher talk about how my child is misbehaving and not doing what he's supposed to be doing. And Ah, my wife's sitting there too. So, but basically, what was happening was my son was, he really decided right from the beginning, I don't know exactly how he had this insight, that school was prison and he didn't deserve to be there. And he was going to make that very clear in every way that he could. In every way that he could, not following the rules, by doing things differently. So for example, this was a big time of so-called open door policy in the 1970s. They called it open door policy. They didn't mean it. They didn't really mean you could walk in and out of that door as you pleased. But he said, "Oh, open door policy. Well, I'm leaving now." And then when it came time in third or fourth grade, you're supposed to start, maybe it was earlier than that, you're supposed to start learning how to use punctuation and capital letters properly. It's when he decided to write like E.E. Cummings, with putting capitals and punctuation wherever he pleased. And he knew E.E. Cummings, and he said, "Well, I'm modeling after E.E. Cummings." So whenever there was an arithmetic assignment and there's some specific way to do it, the only way he could make it interesting was to find some other way to do it, which annoyed the teachers no end. And they would call us in, they'd say, "Well, he's somehow getting the right answer, but he's not doing it the right way. And someday this will catch up to him." So, at any rate, I have pity for the teachers. I mean, if there's no way they could run a classroom if kids were like that. There's no way, no matter how. And they were not bad people. They were trying to figure out how to deal with this kid, and I was fighting with them, and I would tell them, it would be so much easier if you would just do what you're told to do. It's not worth all this. You're just making trouble for yourself. The other kids think he knew the other kids thought he was weird. He's not getting support from anybody,
Yeah.
So so it all came to a crisis. If I remember right, he was in fourth grade, near the end of fourth grade, and it all came to a crisis with the meeting in the principal's office, where at that meeting was the classroom teacher, the assistant teacher, the principal of the school, the assistant principal, the school psychologist, some special psychologist called in from the district for this
Wow.
particular purpose, and his mom and me, all us big adults, and we were all lined up quite literally against him. And the pre-planning of this was we were going to, in no uncertain terms and with a unified voice, tell him that he had to follow the rules of school. And he looked at us and he said, "Go to hell."
Oh, wow. Wow.
And So I started to cry, and his mother started to cry. And we looked at one another, and we could tell by looking at one another that we both agreed he had won. We did not want to go to hell. You know, we did not want, we recognized, I think, at that moment, if we didn't before, that he was right. At least for him, he was right. Um, that this was not a place for him. We didn't know what to do. This was before homeschooling was much even heard of. We weren't really in a position to do homeschooling, even if we had thought of it. So we began to look around for other possibilities. And there were some kind of in the Boston area, there are some kind of progressive schools that you have more choice and supposedly more student centered and so on. And we visited those, and no, he didn't like those either. That was just a little bit more of a more liberal prison. so
Yeah.
we so we so we finally went to Sudbury Valley, which was a school that I actually had heard of but hadn't really seriously considered. It was only 2 miles away from us, which at that time was regarded as distance that a kid could easily walk. So and so he
Yeah.
so he so we visited that, and his response was, well, if this is all true, if what I'm seeing isn't just a show, this is what a school should be. And so he had his visiting week there and enrolled there. And the result of that was, he began to become his old happy self. We began to see the kid that we knew before he ever started school. We saw so much less anger. We saw happiness. We saw excitement about the things he was doing. We saw learning occur at a rapid rate. Um, Not necessarily the learning as prescribed by schools, but learning that's equally, if not more important.
Right.
So both his mother and I were happy with the fact that he was happy and the fact that he seemed to be his bright old self again. But you know, I don't know what it is about dads, but dads worry about whether their kid is going to be able to get a job and move out of the house at some point. Moms don't seem to be so concerned about that, but I'm sure I'm stereotyping here in a very unfair way, but it does seem to be the case that dads in particular get concerned about the possibility that their children will be living in their basement the entire rest of their existence. So I wanted to know that not only would this make him happy as a child, but that he'd be able to make a living as an adult after finishing up there if he stayed
Right.
the entire time. So among other things, like there's a lot of jobs for better, whether it ought to be this way or not is another question, but there are a lot of jobs that you kind of have to go to college if you want to go on to that kind of a career. And so one question was, is he cutting his options short by going to a place where there aren't any courses? I mean, let me tell you about somebody. There are no courses being even offered, let alone required. Sometimes kids will get together and they'll form a little course. They'll say, we're interested in this or that, but only lasts as long as the kids want it and continue to come. And they can usually talk a staff member into being a leader if they want a staff member as a leader, and that happens. But a lot of kids, including my son, really never did anything course-wise. So if you were to, and the kids there from age 4 to through what you would think of as high school age, kids leave anywhere from about 16 to 19, typical kind of high school graduation ages. It's typically when people leave the school. And they're not segregated by age. There's no first graders, second graders, none of that. They're not segregated, and they're not confined to certain spaces. They can go anywhere they want, regardless of age, anywhere on campus and anywhere in the buildings. There's no separate spaces. And there's lots of things to do there, but you're not required to do any of them. You know? And the only rules of the school are rules made by the school meeting, at which each student and staff member has one vote. And the number of students greatly outweighs the staff members. Unlike a typical progressive school, this doesn't require a high ratio of staff to students because the staff doesn't have all that much to do. The kids are on their own, they're learning from one another, they're playing and exploring. The staff kind of have to do the administration, most of the administration of the school, the
I
things
see.
that sort of require legal adult signatures and so on. But they don't follow the kids around, you know, I don't know exactly what the ratio is right now, but I know at one point, the last time I had numbers, there were something like 160 kids and 7 staff members. Now that's the whole staff, so that's
Yeah.
a much lower ratio of staff to students than you would even have in a public school, let alone in a
Right.
fancy progressive school. So
Mhm.
so the school operates at much less than most schools operate, much less than the public schools operate, let alone
Huh.
what private schools operate on a per pupil cost
Wow.
basis. So this is not expensive elite education, right?
Mhm.
If we as a nation decided to adopt this mode of education, taxpayers would save a lot of money.
Oh,
So
Peter, I've been saying that for a long time. I don't know, my little preschool here in the Northwest,
yeah,
I always tried to, I mean, I'd read about the Sudbury School and the Sudbury model, and I tried to create that sort
yeah,
of environment in my little preschool. And I say to people all the time, it's the least expensive way to do it.
yeah,
It's what we're trying to do right now is so expensive and labor intensive, trying to
yeah.
push this information into children all day long, and then
Oh,
keep pushing it in there as it comes back out. Yeah, it's a lot of
yeah.
work.
It's a lot
So
of work.
one of the things I would just wondered if you thought about this when you're telling your story. It occurs to me that if your son were in school today rather than back in the 70s, you would have probably been offered medications.
Oh, yeah.
What do you have to say about that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I definitely do. I mean, it's the so he probably wouldn't. I don't know if he would have been diagnosed as ADHD. He's sort of the opposite of ADHD. You know, he's
Hmm.
very focused. You know, I mean, his
Okay.
rebellion was not the typical naughty boy rebellion. You know, it was more like a planned undermining. You know, so I think it would have been hard for them to diagnose ADHD with him.
Uh-huh.
But they probably would have diagnosed him with something like there's actually something I think called defiance disorder, or I mean that would have been fit him to a T. I don't know if there's a drug for that.
Yeah, I don't either. But I'm
But
just curious about that because I feel like, there was, I think I was in school in the 70s, and say, I think I'm
yeah,
about your son's age. And
yeah,
I do know that, the stories you're telling, you obviously did a good job as a parent in some way, because for a child that age at what, 11 years old, to
yeah,
stand up for himself the way he did and tell you to go to hell.
yeah.
So obviously he had a good head start, nevertheless.
Yeah,
So Peter,
he was actually 9 when he did
oh,
that,
nine.
and
Okay,
he was 10 by the time he started Sudbury Valley in the
great.
fall the next
So
year.
I want to ask you a little bit about your Alliance for Self-Directed Learning, and find out what that's all about. I think the people here at the summit
So
would like to know.
first of all, it's the Alliance for Self-Directed Education,
Self-directed education.
and we deliberately called it the Alliance for Self-Directed Education for several reasons instead of learning, because first of all, um, self-directed education is sort of a more profound concept than self-directed learning. I don't think anybody would deny that children can learn on their own, but they would say, well, what do they learn? Are they are they going to actually learn the stuff that they need to know to do well in life? No big deal. I mean, amoebas can learn, right? I mean, so you're not making a big claim when you say that children can learn. But when you say that children can educate themselves, wow, okay,
Yeah.
that's a bigger claim. So at the Alliance, we define education as learning those things those things that you acquire, that information, skills, and so on that you acquire that help you to live a satisfying and meaningful life.
Oh,
That's so education, which is a term that in our culture has a halo around it. We keep that halo around it. It's the things that you learn that really help you become be happy in life, do meaningful things, be a good citizen, and so on and so forth, which is, I think, what most people would hope that education is aimed at achieving. So that's why we call it that.
I see.
And so the alliance was formed in order to make self-directed education more well known to people, to to present some of the evidence that it works, to bring people together who are involved in it, and to ultimately make it more available to people. We want to normalize it. I would like people to who are involved in, so self-directed education, really what it refers to in terms of, if you're to talk about how one legally does it, refers primarily to people who are doing homeschooling by the means that's often called unschooling, a term
Yeah.
that nobody likes because it's just a negative term.
Yeah.
It tells people what you're not doing. It doesn't tell them what you are doing, but I would rather call it sort of home-based self-directed education, but even the home-based is not really quite true. You get the impression that that means that they're kind of locked at home and they're only learning from their parents and so on and so
Yeah.
forth. But it comes from the fact that officially, legally, to be unschooling, you have to register as a homeschooler, and then instead of doing school at home, you let the child follow their own interests and facilitate that and connect the child to the larger community. So by far the majority of people who are involved in self-directed education, at least in the United States, are unschoolers. The other way you can do unschooling is to enroll your child in a school like Sudbury Valley, and there are now dozens of such schools. They're all pretty small, and some of them are directly modeled after Sudbury Valley. There's a network of them called Agile Learning Centers. It's a growing network worldwide, really. And there are other schools, some of them called Liberated Learners Centers, and so on. Some of these are centers where they are actually legalized schools, where they've convinced either the state or the local school board, depending on how it operates in a particular state, that this is a legitimate school and is certified as a school. It's always a private school, because there's no way that you can, that given the given the rules about public schools, that you can make a school anything like this into a public school. So so that's what so people pursuing self-directed education are doing it in those ways. And we wanted to bring these parties together. We wanted to be a platform for basically promoting and enabling this kind of education.
Oh.
I should say, just for clarity, because this happened just very recently, I've very recently stepped down from the board of the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. I have so many other things to do, and we've got a good group of people working there, and so I'm no longer president of
Well, you're an
ASDE or
incredibly busy
board.
guy, Peter. I
I've
see
been
you turning
I've
up
been very
everywhere.
busy.
This is a
Right.
true mission that you're on here.
Right.
I want to shift gears slightly and just ask you now. So you have then left that, but I know that you and our friend Lenore Skenazy are founding members of another organization called Let It Grow. Could you tell us a little bit about that and some of the work you're doing there?
And once more, I need to correct you on the name of
Okay,
the organization.
good.
It's not Let It Grow,
Let
but you're
Grow.
close. It's just Let Grow.
Let Grow. Well, I appreciate you correcting
and
me.
and what you're letting grow is not an it; it's your child, right? So my understanding is that the appropriate pronouns these days don't include it, but
No, it does
it
not.
includes them.
Uh-huh. Them and they, that's right. And you let
So
people use the names they want to use.
yeah. So at any rate, Let Grow was formed. So Let Grow is, in my mind, kind of the complement to, in terms of my efforts and interests, sort of the complement to the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. So with the Alliance, I'm interested in helping people who've made the decision to leave traditional schooling as we know it, and to make it possible for them to do it, to make it possible for them to do it regardless of income, regardless of background, and so on and so forth. We're looking in a lot of ways to make it more possible. We're trying to work, one of the projects there is to make libraries become centers, publicly supported centers for self-directed
Which I think
education.
is genius. We've already got
So
the facilities and all the stuff there, and we've got
exactly.
librarians are the perfect kind of support for
Oh,
children.
exactly. I mean, they see you. You walk into a library and they don't tell you what to do. They ask you, "Well, what is it you'd like to do?" Let me help you. That's uh, that's um, that's the difference. You know, we libraries, unfortunately, right now get only 1/60th of the amount of public funding that coercive schools get. But maybe over time, as more and more people go to libraries instead of schools, that'll and towns change and how they allocate funding, maybe that'll change.
Well, I'm kind of
So,
thinking that maybe this effort to sort of defund the police and maybe reduce how much money we
right.
spend on that can go to
Yeah.
libraries, which I think would be a very appropriate place for it to go. But anyway,
Right.
I
Yeah.
digress.
So at any rate, Let Grow, the purpose of Let Grow is well, it's really to help all children, but a lot of our focus is with making public schools more child-friendly places than they are. And schools have gotten, as you know, even much worse over the time since my son and you were students in school. They've continuously gotten worse, more and more homework, less and less recess, more and more drill. The creative things that used to exist in school tend to have been taken away. It used to be that for most people, unlike my son, most kids could kind of adapt to it. And it really wasn't until middle school that they started saying they hated school.
Yeah.
Now kids are starting to say in kindergarten that they hate school.
I have heard, I hear that all the time. I'm sorry to interrupt, but man,
Yeah,
I teach, I've always taught preschoolers, and then they would go off for the first, because I did it for 20 years. When I first started,
yeah,
those kids would come back to visit school from kindergarten, and they would always boast how much better their kindergarten was than preschool. Like, oh, I love my school. I love it. We learn cooler stuff, and it's a better place. But I even like my teacher better. But now, the last decade or so, the children have been coming back and saying to me, I wish I could return here. I wish I could come back
yeah,
here. And that to me is the saddest thing.
right.
So anyway,
Yeah, no, I've heard from many, many kindergarten teachers. I give a lot of talks to early educators. I wrote a blog post on the number of kindergarten teachers who are quitting. I've heard from many kindergarten teachers, longstanding kindergarten teachers, that I used to love my job, but now I'm being forced to do things that I know are abusive to children. Really abusive is not too strong a word.
I don't think so either. I call them
Little,
the test score
little
coal mines.
5-year-olds are simply not designed to be sitting and doing seat work and doing worksheets and taking tests or even taking standardized tests, kindergarten kids. A town near me, and I wrote a blog post on this, Brookline, Massachusetts, a year and a half ago, almost all the teachers, kindergarten teachers, or something like 23 kindergarten teachers, signed a petition saying that what they were being required to do, basically saying what they're required to do is abusive to children. The superintendent of schools there resigned after that, but I don't think it was because of that reason. And the new superintendent came in, and I checked later on to see if anything came out of that petition. It did not. It did not. Despite the unified protest, despite the fact that all the people who are on the front lines, who are seeing the kids, who
Yeah.
are dealing with kids who are crying and feeling, who are feeling, whose self-esteem is shot because they feel like they're failures because they can't read. You know, these are
Now,
kindergarten
do
kids.
you have any sense
And,
of why they didn't act on it?
you know, I'm not sure why. And I have followed up a little bit and I've heard from some of the people involved and they're frustrated about it. I just feel it's probably not at the point where they're ready to. I think to get to act, they have to strike, and I don't think that they're ready to do that. They're
Wow, that's a
afraid
big
they'll lose
step.
their job. They're afraid they'll lose their job. And my response always, if if one or two of you said, "I'm not going to do what you're telling me to do. I'm going to teach the way I need to teach," they might get fired. But if everybody did that, are they going to fire everybody?
When especially
I,
in this era of teacher shortages, um,
yeah,
I mean, right now we're already hearing districts have a hard time getting teachers.
yeah,
The last thing they need to do is fire a whole school
yeah.
worth of teachers.
I mean,
So
honestly, this is a frustration. All the teachers I've met who are involved with it, they're all very sweet and very
yeah.
nice people,
Hmm.
and they recognize that what is going on is wrong. But and some of them will say to me, they'll say to me, well, I'm no more free than the kids are, and
Yeah.
my response is that's not true. The kids are required to be there by law. You are not.
Right.
You're there. Nobody, we don't have slavery in this country. You're
Yeah, well,
not,
Peter, this
you're,
is so important for you saying this because a lot of the people here at this summit right
yeah,
now are exactly the people you're talking about right there.
right,
And I know that, what I say all the time is, none of us got into this working with young children because we wanted to, be rabble rousers and change the world.
right.
But you know what? It's time that maybe we do.
Yeah, I mean, I really think so. I think it's just, and we're seeing this all along the way. We're seeing, of course, record levels of anxiety and depression. Of course, it shows up primarily by the time you're a teenager, but it's already showing up even in kindergarten kids. There was one of the studies done a few years ago looked at hair cortisol. Now, cortisol, as you may know, is as a stress hormone. It's released in response, and in chronic stressful situations, it accumulates in the hair, and you can just do a little assay, clip some hair and measure the cortisol. This study, they looked at kids a month before they started kindergarten and a month after, and hair cortisol had shot up.
Oh my God.
Hair cortisol means that you are under the kind of chronic stress that's harmful to your health, to your physical health, as well as your psychological health. This is what we're doing to kindergarten kids. And it only gets worse as you go from grade to grade. And the result of this is we have record levels of anxiety, depression, and suicide among school-age children. Suicide, of course, is just the tip of the iceberg,
Yeah.
but the suicide rate among school-age children is now at least 6 times, according to CDC records, what it was when I was a kid in school. And it's been over the years, really, since I was a kid. This is not brand new. Over the years since I was a kid, school has become an increasingly weighty matter. And in other ways, we have also reduced children's freedom, not just in school, but out of school, we've reduced children's freedom. We've developed these fears of terrible things that can happen to our children if we let them out of our sight, let them go out and play, so that even young teenagers are not allowed to do the things that I could do when I was 5 years old. We've changed. This is, as I've sometimes said it, this is a cruel experiment that we're doing on what happens if we take play away from children. And play really means you've got to get away from adults, because this has always been true, whenever there are adults around, but it's more true today, they're going to intervene, they're going to interfere, they're not going to let you really play unless they're really trained like a play worker is, unless there's, or somebody like you who has taken deliberate steps to know how to step out, to be back, to not be interfering, to not feel like you've got to teach all the time, not feel like you've got to correct people and solve all their problems. because the whole point of childhood is to learn how to take responsibility for yourself.
Yeah.
And as children get older, they can take more and more responsibility for themselves. But you got to start young. You've got to start with how much responsibility can a 2-year-old take for themselves? How much can a 4-year-old? Turns out 4-year-olds in reality can take a lot of responsibility for
Uh-huh.
themselves, way
Well, I
more
even remember as a
than we think.
4-year-old mom saying, I mean, I was 4 and she would say, "You're driving me crazy. Go outside," and close the door behind me. And she didn't expect to see me till she called me back in.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that was normal parenting, and now
Yeah.
if a mother did that, she might be arrested. She might be
Oh,
have
she
her
definitely would be
threatened to
arrested.
have her child taken away
Yeah.
as a for negligent parenting. So those are the things that have happened, and you take away play from children's lives, and what are you going to get? You're going to get depression.
Yeah.
You know, Brian Sutton Smith, the one of the great play scholars who died a
Mhm.
few years ago, used to say that the opposite of play is not work, it's depression.
Oh man.
And that's pretty obvious. What is life, especially for a child, without play?
Yeah.
Pretty depressing prospect. And so we've taken away play. We've taken away just the joyful freedom of doing what you want to do. I don't want to say also even that it's always joyful. It's sometimes hard. It's sometimes there's bullies. There's you get hurt. You
And
do dangerous things, but you're
bickering is a key aspect of play.
exactly, but you're doing it because you want to do it, and you're not being forced to do it. And you can, and generally, and you can quit if you want to quit. You could go home. You could say, "No, I don't want to play with you now. This is bothering me," or So, but so we've taken that away, and what have we replaced it with? We've replaced it with constant competitions. Children are constantly in competitive. School is more competitive than ever before. The activities that we put kids in that we think are substitutes for play are by and large competitive activities. The difference between a pickup game of baseball, the way we always used to play baseball, is nobody cared who won or lost. You cheered wildly when your team made a score, but by the end of the game, you didn't know who won, or if you
Oh,
did, it didn't matter. The next game, the teams are all different. You've chosen them up differently. If it was a lopsided score, you would know, well, we didn't choose the teams right. Hey, let's put Billy over on the other team, right? The goal is to have fun. It's not whether you win or lose. The goal is to have fun and challenge yourself, do the best you can, and you can do all kinds of things a coach would never let you do, catch behind your back, and you're really developing more skill, and you're having a lot more fun, and 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 believe it or not, you're less likely to get hurt when you're playing on your own than you're playing. There's actually research showing this. The rate of serious injuries is much greater in adult-directed sports than it is in self-directed outdoor play.
that's
So
fascinating.
this is what we've done to children.
Yeah.
This is, and so at Let Grow, we're trying to bring back children's freedom, and we're doing it in quite a number of different
Yeah.
ways.
Well, and getting back to Let's Grow, you have recently done a survey of some kind, and you have some interesting results from that.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've done is to do a survey. The survey began about a month into the school closures in the United States, and it was a survey. We hired a marketing research firm to do the survey because they had access to a pool of people willing to fill out surveys for a little bit of money,
Uh,
and so the survey was distributed. Without any indication of what the survey is about. So it's not like people said, oh, this is a survey about how I'm adapting to when they started how I'm adjusting to the pandemic. They just said, okay, so this is a survey for which I'm going to be paid something. It takes a certain number of minutes to do it, and so I'm going to do it. So, and it's a survey of people across geography in the US, across social class, across race, and so on and so forth. Then looking at least in a preliminary way, at the results, the results that I'm going to describe occur regardless of these. It occurs in every region of the United States. It seems to occur for for people who identified themselves as Black as much as for people who identified themselves as white, and so on. So, but although I have to say we haven't looked at that in detail and statistically, but just eyeballing it, I don't see obvious differences. But let me just give you a few of the questions and the findings that I think many people will be surprised at. So one of the questions was, so we had asked questions to the children as well as to the parents, and we asked in this survey that the parents not look over the child's shoulder when the child is answering the questions. So one of the and the children were aged. The way we identified families, they had to be a family that had a child between the age of 8 and 13. So that's the age range, kind of middle childhood age range is what we're dealing with. So one of the questions to children was whether are you more calm or less calm now than before school closures. So twice as many said more calm as who said less calm. Okay, everybody's worried about how stressed children are with the coronavirus. They were more stressed when they're going to school.
Wow. This was the children answering that.
This was the children. So then what about the parents? So we asked the parents, is your child more stressed or less stressed than before the school closures? And again, it was nearly twice as many said less stressed as said more stressed.
Now that's surprising, actually, given all the publicity.
Given all the publicity. Okay, so well, another question was, you would think, with your kids at home, you're going to be in a lot of conflicts with your kids. You're going to be bickering with them. You're going to, you're going to get on their nerves. They're going to get on your nerves. So one of our questions was, during the past week, have you and your child have more conflicts or less conflicts than prior to all this? Only 27% said more conflicts. 73% were in the direction of saying less conflicts.
Wow.
Families are getting along better, stuck at home. All these it's not only school that's closed, keep in mind, it's all these extracurricular things that they've been put in that keep them so busy.
Yeah.
The kids are home more, there's a lot more opportunity for conflict, and yet the parents are reporting less conflict.
Oh, man.
So here's another question. How does seeing how your child is coping with this period make you feel? And then we had a list of adjectives. Some of them were positive adjectives: proud, grateful, impressed, reassured, optimistic. And some of them were negative adjectives: worried, annoyed, disheartened, disappointed. The positive checks outweighed the negative checks 8-1.
Wow, that's incredible.
And here's another question to the parents. I am gaining a new appreciation of my child's capabilities. Agree or disagree? 73% agreed, 5% disagreed, the remaining neither agreed nor disagreed. 73% are gaining a new appreciation of their child's capabilities as a result of the kids being home. So, so these are some of the, so these are questions that kind of run against what a lot of people would think would be happening. Now, I don't want to be all completely, Pollyannish about this. There are, I know, of course, I'm sure that there are families that are suffering, and probably those families are not necessarily the ones who would sign up to be willing to do any kind of a questionnaire. Right. I mean, if you're stuck in a home where the parents hate one another, you're not going to be a lot more calm. If you're in addition to school closures, you've lost jobs, you're being threatened to be thrown out of your apartment, you're going to be, this is going to confound life for the kids as well as for the parents. And so I don't want to pretend that these results apply to absolutely everybody, but this was a pretty wide segment of the population. And so I think it's pretty clear to say that for the typical person, not the impoverished person, but for the typical person in this country, for the typical, certainly middle-class person in this country, whether you're Black or white, the kids are better off now. Even though, even though what I think is the most important kind of play, which is play with other children outdoors, away
Yeah.
from away from parents, can't happen because of social distancing requirement. Despite that, it would be great if this were, but for the first time. And so the other thing, we have some open-ended questions. And on the Let Grow site, there's a wonderful little film of what kids are doing now, and they're talking about the difference with themselves. But we had open questions of, so what are you doing? How are you spending your time? And what's and the questions both to the kids and to the parents about how the kids are spending their time. And a typical kind of response is, well, at first I was bored. Well,
Hmm.
boredom is a wonderful thing. These kids have never had a chance to be bored before. They've been carted around from one activity to the other. We think it's so important to keep our kids busy all the time. And we also think if they're bored, then it's our responsibility to somehow amuse them.
Yeah.
But if your kid is home all the time, you can't take that responsibility to try to amuse them all the time. And so you have to at some point say, well, tough, you're bored, right?
You're driving me
So,
crazy. Go outside.
and the typical mom response would be, okay, well, scrub the floor, right?
Right. Right. Yes.
And
Right.
so, I mean, that would be the healthy mom response, or that's
Uh-huh.
certainly what I would say. I, I remember sometimes when I was a college professor, students would come in to me advisement week, and they would sit down in front of me, and here I've never seen them before in my life, and they say, well, so what should I do? Or and my tendency would be to say, well, maybe you could wash my windows, but at any rate, so what happens with boredom is it gets kind of tiresome to be bored, so you decide to do something.
Yeah.
And so kids are figuring out things to do, and they're figuring out things that maybe they really wanted to do. So one kid said, I've owned a guitar for a couple of years. I've never had time to play it. And he was watching YouTubes and learning how to play his guitar. Lots of kids were learning how to ride bicycles for the first time.
Wow.
We've sort of raised a generation of kids who aren't riding bicycles because number one, they haven't had time to learn how to ride a bicycle. And number two, they're really not allowed to go anywhere on their bikes. So what's the point in riding a
What's the
bicycle?
point? The whole idea
Bicycle,
of the bicycle is to get away from your parents to
the
go
whole
really
point. I
far.
mean, when I was a kid, bicycle was our wheels.
Yeah.
It was the comparable thing to a teenager getting a car. This is how you could get away. This was your freedom. Right? So, but kids don't have freedom. So,
Yeah.
what's the point of having either a bicycle or, when you're of legal age, having a car? People are getting driving licenses at later ages because what the heck? I'm not allowed to go any place anyway, right? So
Yeah.
this is so at any rate, but partly because nothing else to do, partly because the streets are a little quieter and
Mhm.
parents feel a little cooler about
Yeah,
letting the
sure.
kid ride their bike. Kids are learning how to ride bicycles. I've
Well,
seen that
here
from,
in Seattle, they actually just during coronavirus, they've closed a lot of the streets just to give pedestrians room to space themselves, was the
that's
argument.
great.
But
That's great.
now they're talking about let's just leave them closed.
That's terrific. I
Yeah.
think that there will be some permanent changes as a
Yeah.
result of coronavirus.
Well, it's funny when you
So,
told me this, these are such, when you to speak about those results from that survey about parents and their
yeah,
attitudes and everything, this is what early on I was hoping would happen. I mean,
yeah,
that's what's so interesting is, I mean, I'm not a researcher, so I live on just like my, gut instinct.
right,
And I didn't know because of course we have all the stresses of that you hear about. And every educator knows that, especially young children knows that for some children, school is the safe place, right? And they
right,
need, and that's not an argument for school, it's an argument for safe places
right,
for kids because sometimes their home life might be toxic or something.
right.
But this is so encouraging. And then I'm thinking about when you shared with us the kindergarten teachers who knew they were doing the wrong thing
Right.
and all this. Would it have helped them to have had this generation of parents supporting them?
Oh yeah, I think it would, and I think that I think those teachers are going to get more support. I'm hoping so. I really am hoping so.
Yeah.
There are some schools that have gone in this direction. So one of the things that we've done before the Corona closure of schools is to work with certain schools. So there's a whole on Long Island, New York, the pioneers in this, really this single pioneer of this is Michael Hines, who's superintendent of schools, and he was superintendent of schools in the Patchogue Medford School District on Long Island. And he had read my book, Free to Learn, and got in touch with me and got in touch with Let Grow. And Lenore and I and others from Let Grow have been worked with him over a couple of years to change the school culture. And so he made, now unfortunately for Patchogue Medford, because he's become a bit famous, he's gone on to a bigger school district someplace else. And I'm not quite up to date on what he's doing there now. And of course it's been disrupted by coronavirus, but he made, in the 7 elementary schools especially, but also in the middle school and high school, he's made changes. But the elementary schools, you know, among other things, he told the teachers to use their judgment. You know, don't feel you've got to follow the set curriculum. You know, you're the judge of whether the kids are learning and whether they're happy or not, and so on and so forth. He increased recess. He sent out a public announcement to all of the parents, and he said, I support those who opt out of standardized testing. It's legal to opt out of standardized testing in New York, and I support the parents who do that. Mm-hmm. He and most directly in terms of my involvement, he instituted in the 7 elementary schools what they call play club. And everything in school that's not a class is a club, as you might know.
Yeah, right.
And so play club is an hour before school starts. I had hoped it would be either during school time or after school, but for some reasons that, at least in the beginning, it had to be before school. An hour, and he started small, just one day a week, of free play, making use, at least in some of the schools, of pretty much the whole school. Outdoor playground, gymnasium, art room with the art supplies. There's all kinds of loose parts to play with, you know, and all the kids mixed together, kindergarten through 5th grade, not segregated. And so you had to sign up for Play Club, but pretty much everybody signed up for it. I was concerned that the kids aren't going to want to get up an hour early even to play. They do want to get up an hour early to play. They are there. There are oftentimes 150 kids of that whole age of ranges. The only 2 rules for Play Club is you can't hurt anybody or break anything that's valuable.
Okay.
And the teachers, for some reason, there's some teachers union or legal reason, I'm not sure which, that it has to be teachers monitoring the thing. I said don't have teachers, but they couldn't get around that. So I said if there's going to be teachers monitoring, explain to the teachers that while they're monitoring this, they're not teachers. Their job is not to teach. Their job is more like that of a lifeguard on a beach. If there's a real emergency, step in. But if it's a skinned knee, or if it's a little quarrel, or if somebody looks sad, not your responsibility. And you know.
Well, you know, when we were speaking together in Athens, Greece, 2 Aprils ago, Maynell Ames was on the same podium there, and I loved he had the 3-step approach to what to do if you were wondering if you should intervene in children's activities. And the first step was a step back. The second step was another step back, and the third step was a third step back.
Right. Yeah. So at any rate, I was concerned that teachers wouldn't, but apparently they're really doing it. I've been there observing at least once. Lenore Skenazy, been there many more times. The principals say it's working beautifully. The kids love it. And even the parents who were skeptical about it at the beginning, they thought the older kids might bully the younger kids or this or that. You know, of course, it's the opposite. The older kids are protective of the younger kids. When teachers don't break up little squabbles among little kids, an older kid comes over and say, hey, what you doing here? And that's so much more effective.
Well, and that's what I remember from my own childhood. That's the way it worked.
That's the way it works.
You know, we didn't, I mean, you know, there was a kid around. I mean, my next door neighbor for a while his older brother was a notorious bully of younger kids. The younger kid would ally themselves against that boy, and we wouldn't play with him, and then he was left out.
Right. that happens all the time, and that's one of the reasons I said that Sudbury Valley doesn't need a lot of adults, and the adults don't have to follow the kids around. It's
Yeah,
age mix. The older kids are protective of the younger kids,
yeah,
and the younger kids have enough of sense. The 4-year-olds, at least, have enough sense to know I don't want to go walking off into the woods all by myself.
right. Yeah, yeah,
I'll go with some older kids if they invite me or if they're willing to have me tag along. But
yeah.
I'd be a little scared to go by myself.
Sure.
And so this is the way, you know,
Uh-huh.
if it were not that, if kids were not that way, we would not have survived as a species, because this is how we've always been until very modern times. We've always trusted kids to take care of one another.
Well,
We've always, there are still cultures today where 5-year-olds are entrusted to take care of the 3-year-olds,
yeah.
where in the family, that.
Well, and I think this is one of the things that you talk a lot about, our hunter-gatherer past,
Right.
our ancestral past like that. And from that perspective, do schools make sense at all?
Yeah. Well, the book that I am working on now, the title of which is The Obsolescence of School. So
Okay. All right.
I guess that gives away my answer. I do think that, so unlike, in a hunter-gatherer culture, part of my more theoretical writing comes from what I've learned about hunter-gatherer cultures, not by my direct observations, but by my surveys of anthropologists and reading what anthropologists have written. That in hunter-gatherer cultures, you have the situation, these are band cultures, there's, 20 to 50 total people in the band, counting children. They move around from place to place. They're also called egalitarian cultures because
Mhm.
there's no hierarchy with them. There's no chief or big man. They make decisions, but generally by consensus. Um, and as part of their egalitarian ethos, they don't tell one another what to do. If I were to tell you what to do, or even if I were to correct you on something, I would be acting like a big shot. I would be acting like I'm better than you. I would be acting, people would mock me. They would say, "Oh, Peter Gray thinks he's a big man." That would be the way they would shame me for telling you what to do, right? So,
Mhm.
so that's part of the culture. I might, if you're not swinging an axe right, and I'm concerned about that, I'm never going to directly, I might go over and start doing a little chopping myself over here. So in
Uh-huh.
case you're interested in knowing how to use an axe, you might look over and see how to do it. But they take that exact same approach with children. They don't tell children what to do. Children are human beings in their culture. Children are independent human beings. They're not owned by their parents. There's no sense that the parents have any right over the child. The children are members of the whole band, just like everybody else is a member of the whole band. You can't have, as I understand it from all the anthropology, you can't have child abuse in a hunter-gatherer band, because if some parent ever smacked a child, other people in the band would come over, they would see it. This parent is having a problem.
Yeah, right. It's not the kid.
They would take that child away, come into my hut, sleep in my hut tonight,
Yeah.
and somebody else would come over and try to solve the parents' problem. Or if they couldn't solve the problem, they would find ways to, this is a taboo. This is like incest.
Yeah.
Hitting a child is one of the taboos in such cultures. But it's not just hitting. It's, there's this sense of great value of individual autonomy.
Hmm.
Now, by the time a child, so children in these cultures tend to be oftentimes nursed until they're as much as 4 years old. But by the time they're about 4 years old, they're regarded as no longer infants. They now are children.
Right.
And at 4 years old, although they may not even know the exact age, but the anthropologists say it's about 4. Um, the child is regarded as reaching childhood, and that means that this person has common sense.
Okay.
It means that you don't have to. This child can go running with the other children. Adults around are not necessary, but they're running with other children in age mixed groups. They're
Hmm.
not. It's not just like a whole gang of 4-year-olds are
Yeah.
running out
Yeah.
into the jungle with lions and tigers and snakes and so on and so forth, right? So that's the hunter, and the children play I asked how much time do the children have to play, and and children then are defined as from about age 4 to the mid-teenage years. They're
Okay.
still all regarded as children. This idea that teenagers would have been adults in the earlier times may have been true for industrial cultures, not true for hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
You're still a child until you're maybe about 18.
Yeah.
Pretty much the way we think of it in our culture. The ages of childhood are pretty much the ages of what we think of as school ages. And so children are not expected to do much work.
Yeah.
Nobody's required to do work. They just, you do work as you want to do it in a hunter-gatherer culture. And so children, the belief is that children, just like everybody else, has the right to do what they want to do.
Yeah.
But the understanding is that when anthropologists ask them, well, how do they learn? And they say, well, they teach themselves. They learn by playing, by exploring. And then one of the questions I ask the anthropologists, well, what are the things that they played at? And for each of the cultures that were included in this study, I could look at the list of things that they said they played at and match it up pretty well with the skills that are important to learn if you
Wow.
are a member of that
So
culture.
they were actually doing life-derived learning.
They were,
Um,
that's right. So most of these cultures, the men hunt and women don't. So in most of these cultures, the boys are playing at playing with bows and arrows. If they hunt with bows and arrows, they're playing at tracking, which is a
yeah.
terribly difficult skill. They're playing constantly at tracking. There's no privacy in a hunter-gatherer culture because everybody can track one another. So
Right.
so they're playing at tracking. They're playing at and the girls, if it's a culture where girls fish, the girls are playing at fishing. If it's a culture where almost all of them are, where both genders cook and build
Mhm.
huts and do all kinds of other things. They're all playing at that. They're all playing with the musical instruments and the arts of the culture, not only
Yeah.
playing the traditional music, but making up their own. They're playing at the kinds of skills that gradually merge from being what we would all call play to being productive
Yeah.
activities, where they're now the playful hunting gradually becomes real hunting. you
Right.
know,
Right. Yeah.
and so on. And in the one culture in my group, where the Agta in the Philippines, where women also hunt, the girls also played at just right along with the boys at hunting. So the what I think happens is that it's kind of in our DNA as children to look around, see what it is that people do, especially the successful people do, and the people who are, if it's a gender distinct thing, the people of your gender are doing,
Mhm.
and do that.
Well, that's, it makes me, when you talk about this, Peter, it sort of makes me a little bit sad. Because when I look around at our culture today, with the way we've done this,
Right,
is you're talking about people of all ages, of genders, of
right,
capabilities, all kind of living together, kind of openly together, no
right,
privacy and all this. With the
right,
grandmothers supporting and the grandfathers and then the babies and all of this. And what we've done is we've taken our villages or our tribes or our neighborhoods, and we've
right,
divided it all up now. The kids spend all day long over here in this place called
right.
school, and the grown-ups are at this place called work. And we've even taken our seniors and put them in a senior center over here, and we've broken up that village to such a degree that it's kind of shocking to me. And we're all living, like you said, in our isolated homes where things like abuse can take place.
Where things like abuse can take place. And also a really valuable point here is that in a hunter-gatherer culture, you don't, as an adult, even have to think about the child's environment because the child's environment is just there. The child
Yeah,
sees everything that adults do.
yeah,
The child is not segregated. One of the things, although adults don't teach children in the kind of verbal sense that we think of, if a child, let's say, I mean, a lot of the anthropologists have written about examples of this, and some of them described examples to me. But a typical example, so there's a man there making an arrowhead, and a 2-year-old comes over and wants to help him make the arrowhead, right?
Yeah.
2-year-olds always want to help, right?
Yes,
They
they
want to
do.
help. They want to help you cook. They want to help in our culture. They always want to help. In
Mhm.
our culture, we tend to push the 2-year-old away because the 2-year-old is going to slow us down. The
Yeah.
2-year-old might get hurt by that arrowhead. The 2-year-old, and if possible, we separate off our work from where there are going to be any kids because we don't want to bother with kids
Right.
while we're doing our work. But what the hunter-gatherers know is if the child wants to help make this arrowhead, that's how the child learns. And I'll let the child help, even though it's slowing me down.
Yeah.
And so that's the sense in which, if we want to call it teaching, teaching is occurring. You're allowing the child to participate when the child wants to participate. You're
Mhm.
not you're not asking the child to participate. You certainly aren't requiring the child to participate, but you are allowing the child to participate when the child wants to do so. You're not saying no.
Right.
And and the result of that is that children are, one of the ways that children learn is by participating in activities that they're not very good at, and at first they're even a hindrance. But
Yeah.
if you allow them to participate, then lo and behold, at some point they become really, really helpful.
Wow. So Peter, we could talk, we could go all, we could, I'm sure I could listen to you and we could have a conversation that goes on for hours, but we're reaching our time limit here. But we've got a whole bunch of early childhood educators listening to, by the time this thing goes live, there'll be tens of thousands, if not 100,000 people listening to what you're talking about. And if you have anything, as a researcher, as just Peter Gray out there in the world, we're at a time right now where things have been thrown up in the air, right? I mean, it's a time of great, hopefully great change. Sometimes the vacuums that are created are good opportunities. Do you have any advice for early childhood educators who would like to not just create a new normal, but a new, better normal?
Yeah, I mean, it's I really think that early childhood educators have to, I think that most early childhood educators that I have talked to who've been around children understand children a lot better than the people who are making educational policy. And I just think that early childhood educators have to assert themselves.
Yeah.
Really have to assert themselves. Don't just be passive victims, um, because you are not the ultimate victim. It's the children who are the ultimate victim.
Mhm.
And
And
you
what do you
know,
have can you also speak to parents? There's going to be a lot of parents watching this too. What can parents do to support early childhood educators to make positive changes happen?
so the first thing that I think parents, there are several things that I think parents should do that we often forget to do. One is to step back and first of all, think about your own childhood. What was valuable in your own childhood? What are the things you remember? And now I have to say that for some young parents, they don't remember play.
Yeah.
But for some parents, they do remember play. And those who remember play, they remember that play away from adults, that those are their memorable experience. I've done this and with groups of parents. And what are I described, so this idea of the humanistic psychologist idea of a peak experience. Did you remember as a child such an experience, and where did it occur and how did it occur? And it never occurs with a parent around. And usually doesn't occur with any adult around.
Right.
It sometimes occurs when you're alone, and it sometimes occurs when you were with other kids.
Mhm.
And the reason is because if there's an adult around, you are diminished. You're automatically diminished because the adult is bigger,
Mhm.
wiser, more in control, more in source of recesses, and you are automatically diminished. So the adult has to be out of the picture for you to feel like I'm the powerful one here. I'm the one who can do things. I'm the one who's communing with God, or however you want to feel
Yeah. Right.
like what you're doing at that moment. So the idea of parents always want to know, even the best of parents, even the most progressive of parents want to know, what can I do
Yeah.
to help my child? And my response is, that's not the question. What should I stop doing to help
Nice.
my child?
Love it. But
You
Peter,
know,
that's a
yeah.
great place to finish up, I think, right here. I guess I should ask you, I mean, because any good interviewer, and I'm not a good interviewer, I'm the substitute, as I joked earlier. But is there anything I should have asked you that you want to talk about?
I mean, I think I should just draw it to a close. I could go on forever, of course. There's a million things
Me too.
to be discussed here, and we've only sort of touched on some of them. But
Oh
yeah.
yeah. Well, Peter, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure, and I am so glad that our paths have once more crossed, and I hope they continue to cross. I love your work, and it's so important, and I know that everybody's going to get a lot out of what you had to say, even if you have a lot more to say. So, if you want to find out more about what Peter has to say, check out his book, Free to Learn, and also, I guess we've got looking forward to a new book before long.
It may be
Thanks,
a while,
Peter.
yeah. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.